The following video is purely an educational and artistic exploration of the internet and how its constituent infrastructure shapes our world. The creator of this work denounces violence and the destruction of property, be it private, public or military, in the strongest possible terms. Any suggestions to the contrary are entirely satirical in nature. No data centers were harmed in the making of this video.
With that out of the way, let's get to work.
So data center, you have to take permission if you want to record something. Please leave it.
Some of you may have noticed that lately there's been a new kind of invasive species popping up all over the world.
These data centers are being proposed largely in rural areas where land is abundant.
We're worried about how it affects not only the farmland and irrigation, but also ranchers trying to water their herds.
You have to convince your community how great these things are. You can't fight it. You have to go with it.
And local officials often see them as an opportunity for economic development.
I like data centers so much. I wish I lived in one.
These are the smartest people. Most of you in this room, we have a couple probably on the other side of things.
Who would want to stop us from having compute capacity to develop AI? Which adversary would want that? There's only one. It's China.
I don't think that's true. Given that a recent Gallup poll found that 7 out of 10 Americans oppose their construction, either the CCP has been doing a lot of recruiting lately, or there's something else going on. For my money, I think that the massive grassroots opposition to these things has less to do with a sudden mass adaptation of Dengism, and is instead probably more because of data centers' massive energy and water requirements, demonstrably false promises of job creation, not to mention the fact that they emit a constant humming with even more noise pollution below the audible spectrum. Now, to be fair to Kevin O'Leary here, he does have pretty decent taste in music. Also, there is some nuance. I'm not trying to say this to dampen anyone's bloodlust here, but I think that it might be worth going over some basic facts and misconceptions while we're sharpening our pitchforks. One obvious thing is that data centers are nothing new. Ever since the mid-aughts, basically everything not kept on your computer, i.e. pretty much the entire internet, is stored in a data center. That includes your texts and emails, this video, and even the list that the NSA now has put us on. Given that, and this is going to be a pretty unpopular thing to bring up, but since most data centers are in America, if you aren't and don't love the idea of your information being sent to these guys, building more data centers is probably how you go about doing that. Also, crucially, the term data center is pretty broad, covering a server rack in a closet, warehouses the size of major cities, and everything in between. Something that's maybe not the best when it comes to legislating them. That said, we aren't going after anyone's NAS here. The ones we care about are, of course, the big boys, generally referred to as hyperscalers. While we'll be getting into their many issues, the crucial concern that comes up the most is, of course, the amount of resources they use. When it comes to electricity in particular, data centers need to draw massive amounts of energy that's only going to go up as they continue to grow and multiply. This has required huge expansions of power grids in areas where they're most clustered, the burden of which has been shared by local residents who've seen their power bills skyrocket. Another interesting thing is that data centers operate on an N1 redundancy standard, meaning that no single line failing can cause an outage, since power can just be rerouted. Not only that, but in the event of a serious blackout, data centers can switch to diesel backup generators. What this means is that the only way to effectively take a cluster of them out would be if there was a sustained regional outage and the backup generators were somehow sabotaged. So hopefully nothing like that happens, especially since the generators already have about a 33% failure rate. Let me just pause right here and say that given the, shall we say, stochastic nature of this video, I'm more than a little worried about YouTube taking it down, or worse, seeing as, you know, if I were to get sued over this, I definitely wouldn't be able to afford to defend myself without going into a lot of debt, which is where this video's sponsor comes in, PDS Debt. If, like me, you've ever spent any amount of time in debt, you know that it's not so fun. We all know that minimum payments aren't there to get you out of debt, but instead to allow bank executives to buy bigger yachts. Instead of staying trapped in the cycle of balancing payments, click the link in the description or go to pdsdebt.com/inhell to get your free 30-second personalized assessment today. PDS Debt have customized options for anyone struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. They're top rated in the industry with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau. Their average savings per client is over $20,000, and there's no minimum credit score requirement. As long as you've got over $10K in debt, they want ya. If you're carrying any credit card debt, it's costing you money every damn day, and the sooner you do something about it, the better. Checking your options with PDS Debt is fast, free, and won't hurt your credit score. So, get your free 30-second personalized assessment today at pdsdebt.com/inhell. That's pdsdebt.com/inhell. Now, let's talk about water usage. AI data centers use thousands of GPUs, each of which puts out about 10 times as much heat as a human body. To keep them cool enough to function properly, most data centers dump that heat into water for what's called evaporative cooling, which is extremely efficient in terms of electricity use, but as the name suggests, causes about 80% of the water to be removed from the local water table through evaporation. What's more, since GPUs and CPUs are extremely delicate, only the purest drinking water will suffice. This is, of course, the most well-known problem with AI, but how it actually works is complicated. A lot of other people have gone into this in a lot more detail, but a big part of why this is so hard to talk about is that AI companies tend to understate the amount of water they use, while anti-AI people tend to overstate it. In reality, the issue is less a matter of sucking the ocean dry and instead tends to boil down to questions of regional water allocation that often end with the answer, it depends. There have absolutely been cases of data centers taking up way too much of an area's water, and others where it's been basically fine. It's also worth noting that if your big concern is water usage, there are much bigger fish to fry. Data centers don't even come close to touching golf courses or lawns. But as much as people who talk about AI this way annoy me, I'm not just saying this to piss them off or even to dismiss concerns about water entirely. Instead, I think that there's actually something really important going on here. I think one of the most telling examples of what I'm trying to get at here is this video where AOC shows well water that's been somehow contaminated by nearby data centers.
I have a jar right here. This is the current drinking water in Morgan County, Georgia. Right after a data center was constructed, the only difference between the clean water and this was that data center. I have another one as well. So this wasn't just one well.
The thing is that the reason for that is because, in that specific case, construction of data centers disturbed the ground and caused soil and sediment to get into nearby well water. And that does speak to real issues regarding how fast and recklessly these are being built, but that's not just a thing that data centers necessarily do. But also, while this may not be correct, I think it's worth examining exactly why it feels so true. the owners of tech companies have amassed an amount of money and power that's completely unprecedented, and having long since abandoned any pretenses of humanity, are now leaning into remaking the world according to their whims. Given that, there's a sort of poetic logic to seeing data centers, physical manifestations of AI, as a sort of blight, draining the oceans and turning our water black. It also feels appropriate that, given that so many of our lives are controlled by the bloodless brutality of a financialized global market, the monster of our time doesn't take the form of a drone, security camera, or a robot police dog, but instead a windowless office park emanating a low hum. Before we go much further though, I should probably make it a bit more clear where I stand on things, especially given the spicy name of this video. As far as I'm concerned, most arguments about AI tend to boil down to either claiming that it's just a tool that could be used for good, or that it needs to be fought through a return to Ludditism, which apparently means posting online about how you refuse to ever use it. Personally, I am sympathetic to aspects of both, but where they lose me is in how they focus on it being used by individual consumers, which, to me, misses the realities of AI as it actually exists. When you actually dig into the purpose of it, you quickly realize that the tech oligarchs making this technology aren't particularly subtle about their motivations.
I think we are close to a world where you can have like a descendant of ChatGPT watch your computer screen all of the time, watch every meeting you're in, like record every call, everything like that, have perfect context of your whole life.
It's like, what if we just gave the thing like complete access to the production database where it could just like trample on anything? And I sort of like...
I spend a lot of time talking to Nazis, like real Nazis.
Try to get all my smart friends to go work at Anthropic, so that then I'll have lots of friends there who will get me into the Anthropic level 2 breadline.
It's going to take us to a world where we have very high GDP growth and potentially also very high unemployment and inequality.
Never gets sick, never gets high.
Right. Never gets depressed because his girlfriend broke up with him.
Never files HR complaints.
Everyone should tell their kids to quit college and university and go get welding degrees. Like all the white collar jobs are going to get it ordered in May, and I think we're going to see massive hyperinflation in blue collar salaries.
I feel like pretty solidly in level 3.
Breadline,
you know, I don't know, level 1 seems...
There's only 2 jobs, all right? There'll be Anthropic employee and sex worker for Anthropic employees, all right?
Are you seeing insane welding demand in your factories?
100%. Can't build enough welders.
Are you going to automate welding?
Yeah, we are. We already have, actually, secretly.
Do you think there's still a 10 to 20% chance that killer robots mean the end of humanity? That's a high P-doom, as they say.
Well, in the long run, we're all dead, of course.
I mean, part of the crazy thing about people, the Nazis nowadays, is there's not a single Nazi that would ever have included them in their movement and would have shipped them off to the camps quicker maybe than they shipped me off to the camps. But
in my opinion, the promise of AI for them is that it can be used to usher in their dream of techno-feudalism, a world of total surveillance, privatization, and complete capital capture in the hands of a few tech oligarchs. You will own nothing and you will be happy. To do this, the real goals of AI are military and industrial users, and uncoincidentally, despite AI's widespread adoption, major companies and 3-letter government agencies are the only ones actually spending any real money on it. AI, as it exists for you or I, is for now basically just an advertising loss leader, and eventually, if they get their way, a bribe to pay us off for the complete erosion of work, civil institutions, and personal liberties, a sort of privatized UBI. You may need to sell yourself into gig work slavery to make payments on your insurmountable debts under constant surveillance with no social safety net, but hey, at least you'll have a company-provided AI to look after you as your personal assistant, doctor, lawyer, therapist, and romantic partner. Again, just my personal take on things, not trying to make any of this political. And so when it comes to individual consumers, boycotting AI is going to do about as much to stop this as switching to Blue Sky has done to stop Elon Musk from turning Twitter into a right-wing psyop. I don't say this to encourage anyone to doom her out. In fact, very much the opposite. The widespread opposition to data centers, combined with the fact that their construction is generally a local issue, means that this is one area where we actually have political leverage, and so should be the focus of any activism against AI, whether you agree with my little theory there or are sane. Regardless of if you're a neo-Luddite looking to smash the GPUs of production in a Butlerian jihad, believe AI can be regulated into a force for good through a sort of digital bill of human rights, are so deep in AI psychosis that you're worried your smart TV has a Shoggoth in it, or just don't want Meta to build a nuclear power plant next to your home, and are by now getting pretty confused by the direction this video is going. Whatever your stance is, as far as I can see, data centers are, for the foreseeable future, the one choke point still vulnerable enough that we regular people can still wrap our hands around it and squeeze. I'll also come clean a little bit here and say that despite the clickbait title, when it comes to amateur data center demolition, this video is going to be focused much less on the how than the why. Rather than fact-checking any more claims about data centers' water consumption, what I'm much more interested in doing in this video is providing a new lens through which to see AI, data centers, and the internet as a whole. As James Bridle wrote in his book New Dark Age, "When one has a hammer, goes the saying, everything looks like a nail. But this is to not think the hammer. The hammer, properly conceived, has many uses. It may pull nails as well as drive them. It may forge iron, shape wood and stone, reveal fossils, and fix anchors for climbing ropes. It may pass sentence, call to order, or be thrown in a contest of athletic strength. Wielded by a god, it generates the weather. Prehistoric hammers and axes turned up by the plows of later generations were called thunderstones and were believed to have fallen from the sky during storms. These mysterious tools thus became magical objects when their original purpose passed away. They were capable of taking on new symbolic meaning. We must re-enchant our hammers, all our tools, so they are less like the carpenters and more like Thor's. More like thunderstones." But before we get into any more of this weird woo-woo shit, let's take a step back and get to know our enemy, starting with where data centers spring up. When it comes to choosing the locations for them, historically there have been four main criteria. First up is temperature. About a third of data centers' power consumption goes to cooling, and so there's been a push to save on that by building them in cooler climates. This has been particularly big in Sweden, where they've been building a ton while developing techniques for heat recapture, using the excess heat created to heat people's homes. While this is a cool idea, most of these things aren't being built in the Arctic, and the reason for that is because this is by far the least important factor. A much bigger one is instead tax incentives. Obviously. Why build in Siberia when you could just pay for cooling with money to spare in any number of places looking to get into the data center game? From Ireland to Malaysia, countries with an abundance of electricity and no one to sell it to are putting on their skimpiest tax policies to catch the interest of big AI. But tax policy turns out to not be that important either, precisely because it's so prevalent that companies can afford to be choosy, since it's so easy to find a country that's willing to be a bit loose with their tax and regulation policies. But while global flows of capital may be fluid, one thing that isn't really going anywhere, and therefore what really sets potential data center locations apart, is infrastructure. Specifically, access to a robust electrical grid and lots of water. But also, as Tyler Patrick McCrea documented in his thesis paper, Sensing the Cloud, there's another building that data centers tend to be built near: Amazon fulfillment centers. And that seems a bit strange, eh? I mean, fulfillment centers are built extremely strategically for maximum access to ground transport, something that data centers obviously don't really need. There are some explanations for this, since said fulfillment centers are also generally very close to airports, not to mention that Amazon Cloud Services is the biggest single owner and operator of data centers, so it wouldn't be too surprising if they'd found certain advantages to grouping their stuff together. But in his thesis, McCrea points to something else. As I talked about in my video about AI weapons, there's a concept in critical geography called code space, used to refer to places where the computer code that runs them is just as, if not more important than the physical infrastructure. For example, early on the morning of January 11th, 2023, an FAA employee tipped over the first in a long string of dominoes when they accidentally deleted a few lines of code in the Notice to Air Missions, or NOTAM, software. This first led to the corruption of one of the program's databases and soon caused the entire system to fail, leading to an hour-and-a-half-long delay of all departure flights in America. Essentially, without those lines of code, every airport in the country stopped being airports and were instead transformed into massive buildings filled with angry people. Amazon works in a similar way, although they take things significantly further. In order to run a massive store that not only sells anything and everything, but also ships it out at speeds so fast that people avoid thinking about how, in a similar way they do with factory farming, Amazon uses a lot of advanced proprietary techniques to ensure their warehouses are running at peak efficiency. One of these tricks is what they refer to as their chaotic storage system. Basically, while fragile meatbags like us might think to organize a warehouse using logical categories, Amazon instead sorts their football field-sized storage facilities according to the whims of an algorithm that determines the most efficient layout based on statistical analysis of which items are likeliest to be bought together. While employees have to bring their own modular porta-potties from home, something they are provided with is a Zebra TC53E, or a similar handheld scanner that gives them directions to any item they need to find. Despite proving to be effective at shaving precious seconds off the time it takes to get each item, the layout is so confusing that not even seasoned workers are able to make sense of it. This goes well beyond other code spaces to the point where Amazon warehouse workers are made to navigate an incomprehensible maze based on the algorithm's alien logic. And so it seems kind of appropriate then that data centers are so often placed near these warehouses, since in a way they're doing the same thing, remaking the physical landscape in the algorithm's own image in service of the cold logic of profit optimization. The way this works is that, like any invasive species, once data centers come to an area, they quickly start to multiply. There's a few reasons for this. First of all, there's a strong incentive for them to cluster together, since being in close proximity allows them to share electrical infrastructure and cooling equipment in order to cut costs. It's also very common for data centers to work in tandem. For instance, some focus on storage while others do computing. Having these different data centers side by side, or at least in the same area, lowers latency, which can provide competitive advantages. Once this process starts, like a particularly aggressive cancer, data centers don't need to multiply much before they begin negatively impacting the surrounding area, while the massive demands they place on local power grids and water tables cause the prices of these utilities to shoot up for locals. Also, remember that these are generally built in suburban and rural areas where local industries tend to be pretty water and power intensive, like agriculture and industrial plants. Before long, the rising costs of power and water cause these to close up shop. Same goes for local residents, as meter rates spike and constant low humming causes their cortisol to do the same. They're eventually pushed out, selling their land to the companies responsible, who are, by now, the only industry looking to buy. This process of techno-forming an area creates a vicious cycle so well known that it even has a name. Originally coined by the data center REIT Digital Realty, the process is now known throughout the industry as data gravity. Now, this is getting a bit abstract, so I decided to get a better idea of what this all looks like by mapping it out. Well, as I'll be covering more soon, the big tech companies are notoriously secretive about data centers, regularly lying about their environmental impacts and even their existence. This is, of course, a huge problem for public accountability and, more importantly, this video. However, most data centers aren't actually owned by tech companies themselves, but instead private firms called real estate investment trusts, or REITs. Since they're trying to sell data centers, they have an interest in providing information for other players in the industry, which is where we're going to get all of our data. I used an industry website called datacenters.com and pulled a page out of AI's playbook by scraping the site, roughly geocoding the entries, and then throwing them into a map. This is far from perfect, since I wasn't able to get exact locations for a lot of them, not to mention that a lot are straight up missing, but it does give us a rough idea of global distributions. One thing that really sticks out, of course, is how many there are in America, and in particular, one small area that exemplifies everything I've been talking about. A section of Northern Virginia called Data Center Alley. Centered in Ashburn, but now stretching out over Loudoun and Fairfax counties, with around 50 million square feet devoted to data centers and 70% of the world's internet routed through there. Data Center Alley lives up to its name as the largest data center market on Earth. The story of how North Virginia became the massive hub it is today started in 1992, when a group of guys working in the fiber optic network game got together to shoot the shit over some cold ones. Things got a little frisky, one thing led to another, and before the night was through, the men there decided to link their networks together to create May East, the world's first non-government internet exchange point. The following year, the National Science Foundation, who were at the time running the pre-internet internet, but gearing up to offload it to the tender embrace of the free market, made May East one of the first 4 privately run network access points. Then, in '97, AOL moved their headquarters to Ashburn and also gave the city its first ever data center in the form of a massive bunker-like structure called the Dulles Technology Center. Not only that, since the early .com era was at the time booming with nowhere to go but up, AOL invested in infrastructure, laying a massive amount of fiber optic cables. This, along with Ashburn's electricity being 28% cheaper than the national average, not to mention its proximity to Washington and the Pentagon, ideal for any enterprising tech companies looking to pick up some sweet military contracts. All of this made the area an ideal tech hub for the newly emerging internet, and so more companies flocked to the area and built headquarters and infrastructure of their own. That is, until the roaring 90s came to a halt at the turn of the century, when, in 2000, the dot-com bubble burst, and 8 years later, the housing bubble followed suit, taking most of Northern Virginia's tax base with them. To bail themselves out, Virginia cut taxes for data centers and rebranded as the world capital of internet infrastructure. Also, interestingly, while you probably won't be surprised to hear that the negative effects of data centers disproportionately affect poorer, racialized areas, given data centers' heavy infrastructure demands and tendency to be concentrated in areas with a big tech sector, they're actually pretty likely to be found in more well-off areas too. A fact that I imagine is a big part of why this issue is a surprisingly bipartisan one. In a paper titled Land for AI, Dillon, Mahmoudi, and Alan Wiig described going to North Virginia, where they saw cash for home signs in poorer areas and we buy Cisco in richer ones. While, as you'll see, data centers are absolutely nothing new, the size and number of them that we're now seeing is. A study by Sydney Research Group counted 1,136 functioning hyperscale data centers at the end of 2024, double the amount 5 years earlier. More notable than the number is the scale, though. Sydney found that capacity is doubling every 4 years, while a US Department of Energy report from 2024 found that power consumption from US data centers grew from 58 terawatt hours in 2014 to 176, or 2.4% of all US electricity usage by 2023. The cause for this is, of course, AI. So, how did we get here? The term AI dates back to a computer scientist named John McCarthy at Dartmouth College in 1956. Originally, he'd used the term automata studies, but when that failed to attract much buzz, he changed it to artificial intelligence, which immediately caused the fledgling field of study to receive significantly more attention and funding. But as the discipline grew and developed, the researchers at Dartmouth split into two competing camps, the symbolists and the connectionists. The latter believed that intelligence could be understood as an emergent property that could arise in a brain or computer if only it had enough connections. The symbolists, on the other hand, believed intelligence came from encoded knowledge, either acquired the old-fashioned way through embodied experience in the world, or by manually programming thousands of rules for a machine to follow. This argument became a bitter rivalry, with academics on both sides taking shots at each other. In the mid to late 60s, the symbolists won out. However, connectionists have gone on to win the war. They did this, in part, by getting some external help. As Karen Hao argues in her book Empire of AI, connectionism has two major advantages. It was way better at producing a product with an immediate commercial application, and it requires massive amounts of data to train on, a resource that the richest companies on Earth just so happen to be flush with. And so, it's not so surprising that the generative AI we know today didn't come out of Dartmouth, but from Google and one of their newest competitors. Founded in 2015 by a team that most notably included Sam Altman and Elon Musk, OpenAI began as a non-profit, born out of Musk's fears that Google and their newly acquired DeepMind lab were on the verge of creating super-intelligent artificial general intelligence, which, if left in their hands, Musk feared would breach containment and destroy the world. To beat Google to the punch, Musk armed his new startup with $30 million in rolled-up bills that smelled faintly of ketamine. In 2017, they had their major breakthrough, ironically thanks to Google, who had just published their Transformer paper, outlining a new architecture for training neural networks that basically involved looking at every word in a text simultaneously rather than one at a time in order to better understand context. OpenAI's chief scientist and co-founder Ilya Sutskever realized that this was the key they'd been looking for. All they needed to do now was scale it. This, however, came with plenty of what should now be very familiar issues. They soon coined the term OpenAI's Law, a reference to Moore's Law, which states that computer chips roughly double in efficiency every 2 years. OpenAI's riff on this classic had a big problem, though, as their new law left more in the dust, stating that AI compute usage doubles every 3.4 months. But don't worry. The geniuses at OpenAI weren't about to let this stop them, and sure enough, by pulling their collective heads together, they figured it out. Since they couldn't rely on faster chips, they focused on getting way more of them. And so, abandoning their non-profit status and taking $1 billion from Microsoft, they went all in on buying as many GPUs as possible to escape Moore's Law. I cannot overstate that this is the entirety of their secret sauce. Spend more money so they can buy more compute. As Hao writes, in part fueled by the realization that scaling alone could produce more AI advancements, many employees also worried about what would happen if different companies caught on to OpenAI's secret. The secret of how our stuff works can be written on a grain of rice, they would say to each other, meaning the single word scale. That secret has long since broken containment, leading to AI research becoming an arms race to see which of the largest companies on Earth can build the most data centers, with the field being dominated by what are referred to in the biz as hyperscalers. The 5 biggest being Amazon Cloud Services, then Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and then in a distant fourth there's Meta Platforms, with Alibaba Cloud bringing up the rear. All of this has by now scaled up to cartoonish proportions, with OpenAI comparing their soon-to-be-built Stargate data center to the Manhattan Project, only to be outdone by Meta announcing not 1 but 2 massive data centers much more deserving of the comparison. One named Prometheus that's set to run on nuclear power, and another called Hyperion that's literally the size of Manhattan. Meanwhile, Microsoft has penned a deal to reopen 3 Mile Island, betting they can't fuck things up as bad as the last guys. Elon Musk, on the other hand, decided to go in a characteristically epic direction, training his Mecha Hitler chatbot at the appropriately toxic Colossus data center, which, to avoid having to wait to be connected to the grid, Musk initially powered using unpermitted methane turbines, the exhaust from which caused the rates of asthma, heart attacks, and cancer in the surrounding city of South Haven to skyrocket straight to the moon.
You can't help it, that's okay.
But don't worry, all that land, water, and electricity is going to a very good cause. In 2025, the data center industry was responsible for 69% of GDP growth in America, with comparable figures all over the world. So, given that this one little industry is the primary driver behind so much economic growth, let's take this opportunity to look under the hood. First up, there's revenue. So, in 2026, the big 5 hyperscalers are on track to make $320 billion, which sounds great until you realize that they're also spending $800 billion, and as one of the partners of Sequoia Capital, David Kahn, argued in 2024, in order to turn a decent profit, they need to pull in revenues that are quadruple the amount that they're spending on chips, meaning that by the end of 2026, they would need to hit a cool trillion. And between you and me, I'm not sure they're gonna make it. There's a couple causes for this lack of cash flow. For one thing, only around 3% of individual AI users actually pay for it. And when it comes to companies, an MIT study found that 95% of businesses don't see any improvements from using it. Don't worry though. The major companies have all confirmed that they'll solve all of that by, you guessed it, building way more data centers. I mean, why would they lie about something like that? There is plenty of good news too, though. You see, these companies have lots of clever little ways to keep things going in the meantime, like building way more data centers. Typically, they do this by taking on debt, but as you know, the people speedrunning us all straight to hell are the smartest around, so they get pretty creative with it. For example, Meta's funding their Hyperion campus through a $27 billion loan from Blue Owl, but did it through a separate company they set up to run it called an SPV, which allowed them to keep the debt off of their books, so it looks like they have a lot more money than they actually do. Along with this, all of the hyperscalers have also been taking on much longer-term loans or refinancing existing ones to put off paying them until their profits materialize, which any accountant will tell you is always a good sign. Another trick they have up their sleeves is investing in each other. For example, Nvidia's given OpenAI around $30 billion, which they've in turn used to buy more chips from Nvidia. Some might call this a fraudulent practice meant to artificially inflate their perceived value, but I just call it believing in your friends, since now if one company goes down, the others do too. There's actually one company in particular who does all these things: CoreWeave. They're what's called a neo-cloud company, meaning that they rent compute specifically for AI whenever any of the big 5 need more than what their own data centers can provide. The thing is, though, that despite being rich in chips from Nvidia, who is, you guessed it, their investor, CoreWeave has a bit of a problem. In just the last year and a half, they've managed to rack up $21 billion in debt, for which they're now paying 25% of their profits just to cover the interest. What's more, for collateral, they put up all of their NVIDIA cards, which, for any non-gamers here, every year NVIDIA releases a new, better model, causing last year's cards to tank in value. Yikes. All this stuff has caused some people to wonder if maybe this whole thing is some kind of a bubble, but don't worry, I can assure you, only if their growth stalls or really anything at all goes wrong. So, with that said, one small issue is that in order for these AI companies to keep growing, they need to make more advanced models, which require more energy and compute. And we have already reached the point where it is physically impossible for them to build new data centers fast enough to keep up with demand. Like, this isn't a question of whether or not AI can live up to the hype, or like with the Moore's Law thing where they just threw money at it. Instead, we're now in the territory of just the basic realities of electrical infrastructure and supply chains. It takes 2 to 3 years to build a data center, but 4 to 7 to hook it up to the grid. There's no real way around the fact that this bottleneck is going to cause the industry to massively stall. That said, there are plenty of people, generally with certain vested financial interests, who have tried to argue against this. One argument that you'll see is that people have freaked out about other bubbles in the past, but even when they burst, they still left infrastructure behind that allowed new technology to flourish. However, the fact that so much of growth is riding on just 4% of the economy does in fact make this significantly worse than past bubbles. Another argument that I find kind of hilariously dishonest is that AI will just fix this. The first head data center architect at Google, Urs Hölzl, has made this case, claiming that as AI gets smarter, it'll naturally become more efficient. The thing is that while, yes, training and usage do become more efficient over time, all of that efficiency gets eaten up by higher demands. For anyone interested in making that kind of an argument, I'll believe it when you can show me any point in time when AI power consumption was lower than it was the previous year. With that said, any Luddites watching this might not want to bust out the rack punch for a husky frolic just yet. First of all, none of what I said here is actually an indictment of the technology itself. While I'm certainly skeptical of a lot of these tech people's claims that they're building a new god that will kill us all, I'm also definitely not someone who thinks that AI is just fancy autocomplete or that it still can't draw hands. Regardless, whether AI flops or turns into a man-made Moloch extinguishing the stars at the end of time in order to make more paperclips, nothing I've been talking about here spells the end for this technology or any of the major tech companies. Other than CoreWeave. Those guys are full. Instead, what we're already seeing is a move by these tech companies to scale back, become more decentralized with data centers being built in more places all over the world, investing in their own off-grid power sources, generally nuclear, and along with that, a sort of restructuring in which they move from being services to utilities providing AI tokens. One advantage of this is that it means that the S&P 500 probably won't melt into a puddle of molten lithium. However, while the big tech companies will be fine, for the rest of us, things probably aren't going to turn out as well. How bad this will actually be depends on how over-leveraged and interconnected all of these companies are when they finally hit a wall. But given what we're currently seeing, I'm not optimistic. Worst case, the AI companies' stumble causes growth to stagnate, which is particularly bad for the countries with the most riding on AI, namely the US, Ireland, Malaysia, Japan, and the Gulf states. It gets worse if lenders get spooked, causing them to stop lending to anyone. Meanwhile, a significant drop in stock prices would threaten to bring down the whole market, including pensions along with it. Finally, if data centers shutter up or just go off the grid like they're already planning to do, all that power infrastructure that's been built for them all needs to be paid for by someone, and that someone is going to be all the people in the surrounding area who can expect to see even bigger increases in their utility bills. Essentially, while these companies win no matter what, regular people are in a lose-lose situation. Either AI fails and takes the economy down with it, or else it succeeds and the big tech companies own the world and replace all of us, a goal that they're more than happy to say to our faces. But as I keep saying, data centers go back significantly further than AI, and so to really understand what we're up against, we'll have to do the same by talking about the origins of the cloud. There's an old joke in tech circles that when someone pitching a product starts talking about how something is going to be handled by the cloud, what they're really saying is that they don't know how it's going to work and would like everyone to please stop asking. Not the strongest joke, but it is accurate. Interestingly though, this is far from a new phenomenon. Rather than being dreamed up in the early 2010s by some 25-year-old startup founder pitching investors on Uber for blood while finely crushed modafinil dripped down the back of his throat via the nasal cavity, using the metaphor of the cloud as a sort of vague world of make-believe used to hand-wave away technical concerns is actually one of the oldest traditions in computing. Predating the internet by a wide margin, we can find prehistoric cave paintings of the cloud at least as far back as 1951 with AT&T's Electronic Skyway, and then again in 71 with this diagram depicting the 3 interconnected networks needed for AT&T's short-lived picture phone service as overlapping clouds. But if we're looking for early rumblings of the cloud slouching towards San Francisco to be born, we can go significantly further back than that. In 1884, a British art critic named John Ruskin was worried about the sky. He believed that he had spotted a new kind of cloud on the horizon, and so, to get the word out, Ruskin held a series of lectures at the London Institute titled The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. The lectures include exhaustive descriptions of the nature of clouds based on the science of the day, his own observations that he'd written in his diary, and a thorough survey he'd conducted investigating every mention of clouds throughout classical art and literature. All of which led him to the conclusion that this new cloud was entirely unprecedented. There is no description of it, so far as I have read, by any ancient observer. Neither Homer nor Virgil, neither Aristophanes nor Horace acknowledge any such clouds among those compelled by Jove. Chaucer has no word of them, nor Dante. Milton none, nor Thomson. In modern times, Scott, Wordsworth, and Byron are alike unconscious of them, and the most observant and descriptive of scientific men, de Souza, is utterly silent concerning them. This was not a happy discovery. Ruskin called his new cloud a storm or plague cloud, and went into great detail describing its various behaviors and qualities, such as that it always blows tremulously, making the leaves of the trees shudder as if they were all aspens. These sudden and aggressive winds would then, according to Ruskin, lead to an intense and unnatural darkness, which he described as a dry black veil which no ray of sunshine can pierce. And worst of all, the vibes were off. Ruskin claimed that the plague cloud had a certain sinister nature to it that corrupted the sky and air. It is a malignant quality of wind, unconnected with any one quarter of the compass. It blows indifferently from all, attaching its own bitterness and malice to the worst characters of the proper winds of each quarter. He attributed these plague clouds in part to industrialization and the rise of capitalism, for which these lectures are now seen as foreshadowing the environmental movement. But as James Bridle argues, this might be something of a mischaracterization. Towards the very end of the first lecture, Ruskin dismisses the environmental angle and argues instead that something supernatural may be afoot. His theory was that the clouds didn't come from coal or factories, but instead rose from the battlefields of the recent Franco-Prussian War. Reciting an entry from his diary dated July 1st, 1871, he noted, "The plague cloud looks partly as if it were made of poisonous smoke. Very possibly it may be, There are at least 200 furnace chimneys in a square of 2 miles in every side of me, but mere smoke would not blow to and fro in that wild way. It looks more to me as if it were made of dead men's souls, such of them as are not gone yet where they have to go, and may be flitting hither and thither, doubting themselves of the fittest place for them. Now, I'll admit that I'm a bit of a skeptic with these kinds of things, and so tend to find the chimney explanation a bit more convincing than ghosts. But with that said, I think that Ruskin was still onto something, for which he deserves his spot in the history we're about to dive into. Because today, just like back then, there is a new cloud in the sky, and as you'll see, it too emanates out of sites of conflict. Before we get there though, the next stop on our history is 80 years after Ruskin's lectures in An Ocean Away in America, where a man named Paul Barron was also worried about the sky. This was a reasonable concern. The year was 1960, a time when the nuclear age and escalating Cold War had given him, along with the rest of the world, another new cloud to fear. Barron was a Polish-American engineer who'd recently begun working for the RAND Corporation, one of the first ever think tanks. It was originally created as a spin-off from America's Department of War in order to conduct privately run R&D for US foreign policy and military technology. Shortly after joining, Barron was given his first major assignment, developing a communications network for the US military that could survive a full-scale nuclear attack. He conducted research examining the structures of every communication system in the country and soon noticed an underlying pattern. While the military and telecom companies had been developing plans to move the network cables either underground or, this is real, into outer space, Barron realized that that wouldn't solve the deeper problem. The network's true weakness wasn't their location, but their shape. Since the networks were built around a single node through which all communications flowed, an attack on the central node risked taking down the whole network. Barron named these centralized systems and warned the military of the risk they posed, suggesting the construction of a new kind of network, arranged in an interconnected web. These decentralized and distributed systems would have built-in layers of redundancy so that data would still flow even if any individual nodes were destroyed. In 1964, Barron pitched his work to the military, who brought along representatives from AT&T, the latter of whom weren't interested, saying to Barron, first, it can't possibly work, and if it did, damned if we're going to allow the creation of a competitor to ourselves. But certain ideas have a tendency to stick around, just waiting to be used, and in the case of Barron's lattice-shaped networks, they didn't have to wait long. 2 years after Barron's unsuccessful meeting with the military and telecom brass, another team of government scientists began to work on what would be the most important network of the modern age. The scientists were working at, friend of the channel, ARPA, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and while what they were working on would soon completely change the world, at their time their goal was much more modest. They wanted to find a way to get 3 cutting-edge computer servers located in different parts of the country to talk to each other. Their breakthrough came when they stumbled upon Barron's report in which he'd mapped out his proposed network structure. This was it. The theory he'd come up with for a communication system that could survive a nuclear bomb was exactly what the researchers needed to build a network for computers that spanned America and soon the world. In short, Paul Barron had unknowingly designed the internet. Or at least that's how the story generally goes. The thing is that it isn't exactly true. As the former director of ARPA, Stephen Lukasik, wrote, Barron's proposed system had many features still sorely lacking in the public internet 40 years later, such as the redundancy to withstand heavy attacks yet fail gracefully as links were severed, high reliability, security of the information within it, and the ability to defeat malicious users inside and outside the system. Yeah. Turns out that while the folks at ARPA did cite Barron's work, they quickly realized that all those layers of redundancy needed to nuclear bomb-proof the network were incredibly expensive and oftentimes pretty much impossible to actually implement, since, like, running fiber optic cables through mountains is really fucking hard. In reality, most internet infrastructure is actually very centralized, and far from being weightless, it carries a lot of baggage. We can see this in the undersea cables that carry the internet across continents, following the same routes that were first developed by the Eastern Telegraph Company to connect the various outposts of the British Empire. As Nicole Starosielski argues in the book The Undersea Network, modern-day submarine cable landing points are the not-so-distant descendants of the telegraph stations which serve to enforce the political power of Great Britain by connecting her colonies and exerting a civilizing force on native populations. It's honestly kind of amazing looking at an old map of telegraph lines and seeing how it matches up with one of internet cables almost exactly. The same is also true for America's terrestrial fiber optic cables and another, even older network, the railroad. The reason for this is because beginning in the 70s, the Southern Pacific Railroad began selling access to the fiber optic cables they'd buried along their tracks to operate their internal communication system. This soon led to the creation of two new companies, Southern Pacific Railroad Internal Networking Telephony and the Southern Pacific Telecommunications Company, better known today as the Sprint and Quest networks. But the parallels between railroads and modern fiber don't end at the lines on the map. As Tung-Hui argues in his book A Prehistory of the Cloud, which, by the way, is amazing and going to be the main source I'll be using for most of the rest of this video. Just as the Chinese laborers who broke and poisoned their bodies constructing the railroads were systematically erased from all photographs documenting the construction, so too is the labor performed by people in the global south that keeps the internet working, likewise hidden from view. As Hu writes, a new 1.5 billion fiber optic cable across the Arctic will shave between 20 and 60 milliseconds off the route from Tokyo to London for stock market traders. But the toxic metals used in their electronics inevitably end back up in the bodies of laborers manning poorly regulated disassembly plants in China. Their bodies are absent from the picture, just as the Chinese bodies of railroad workers are absent from 19th century railroad photographs. Coming back to the story of Paul Barron now, while it isn't exactly true, it's remained extremely famous to the point where he's often referred to as the father of the internet. And look, nothing against Paul here, he was undeniably a genius, but it's worth asking why this narrative of the internet as a weightless distributed cloud born out of a Cold War bomb shelter has stuck around for so long. There is, of course, the obvious answer that it just makes for a way easier story to tell. That's genuinely a completely valid reason, in my opinion. Sometimes details have to be simplified in order to fit things into a narrative people can actually follow. Having to say that Barron's work was influential but ultimately not adopted due to logistical constraints doesn't really fit as nicely into a Wired headline or video essay. But also, Who argues that some of the appeal of this simplified version likely stems from how well that story fit into the feeling of that time. The zeitgeist of the 60s was dominated by the fear of an apocalyptic nuclear confrontation, as well as an obsession with interconnected networks. The latter of which, thanks to the works of thinkers like Norbert Wiener and Buckminster Fuller, rapidly spread through academia and then into the military and the hippie counterculture, becoming the intellectual backbone of that time. As I talked about in my video about Tor, through this theory of cybernetic systems, the world came to be understood as a massive collection of feedback loops. Through this view, it was thought that by collecting enough data, it would become possible to predict or control all of these networks, breathing new life into the promise of the Newtonian clockwork universe, now reimagined as an ecosystem contained inside a sealed terrarium. Followers of this theory came to advocate for the creation of new interconnected networks and the collection of massive amounts of data, believing that by doing this they could create a world where everything from nature to cities and governments could be perfectly managed and controlled. The historian Mark Wigley coined the term network fever to describe this intoxicating effect of systems theory. For Wigley, the carriers of this fever came to see everything as a kind of network, to the point where the word lost all meaning. In terminal cases, the patient becomes so lost in this manic euphoria that they begin evangelizing for the creation of bigger and even more interconnected networks, while ignoring their darker consequences. In celebrating this new kind of territory, we recast questions of individual identity in terms of unimaginable levels of connectivity, ignoring the equally dramatic rise of new forms of inaccessibility to stage an institutionalized simulation of euphoria in which discourse about openness, democracy, free exchange, and speed dominates over that of control, surveillance, blockage, sedation, and crime. But as Hu points out, there's another more fundamental problem with this obsession with seeing everything as completely interconnected. And that's that not everything is actually connected. And in fact, thinking that it is itself a symptom of paranoia. Like, people who say, I don't believe in coincidences, are at most weeks away from lining their secret bunker in wall-to-wall Faraday shielding material. And so, from that perspective, it's not too surprising then that the preferred creation myth for the ultimate network of networks would be that it was a byproduct of Cold War nuclear defense systems. Appropriately, Paul Barron was a deeply paranoid man himself. Included in the archives at Stanford, where all of his work now lives, is this: a cardboard calculator that could be used to determine the blast radius of a nuclear bomb. Barron carried it on his person at all times until the day he died. This paranoid environment, as well as the vulnerability of America's centralized communication networks, were both brought into sharp focus in the wee hours of May 28, 1961, when, beginning around 5 a.m., 3 AT&T microwave receiver stations located in the Great Salt Lake Desert near the Utah-Nevada border exploded one after another. The blasts were caused by dynamite that had been placed at each station and then strung together with a homemade detonator fashioned out of an alarm clock. But despite the Looney Tunes nature of the explosives, the amateur demolitionists responsible definitely knew what they were doing. The receivers they destroyed had been selected with surgical precision. Not only did their remote location mean minimal security, said remoteness also made them a crucial choke point connecting California to the rest of the country. As a result, the unscheduled demolition of these 3 stations cut off all calls, telegraphs, and TV signals for over 20,000 people. But while that may sound bad, the stations were repaired and service restored very quickly. What was harder to deal with, though, was that the blasts also set off an explosion of paranoia as theories began to circulate speculating that the attack was carried out by the Kremlin or even the Pentagon. In reality, the bombing had been carried out by a group calling themselves the American Republican Army, although the name is somewhat misleading, as this army turned out to have been made up of just 2 people, a 51-year-old New York real estate investor named Jerome Bruce and a 33-year-old Nevada construction worker named Dale Jensen. These unlikely brothers in arms turned out to have been motivated by an incredibly based shared hatred of AT&T and had carried out this attack in the hopes of intimidating the telecom provider into providing lower rates and better customer service. People really used to just do things. Nowadays, everyone's just staring at their phones all day, thanks to providers like AT&T. As you may have guessed, though, the plan did not succeed. Exactly 3 weeks after the bombing, the FBI caught Brous and Jensen on a yacht in Mexico, from which they were swiftly extradited. Once the two were in custody, the conspiracies surrounding the attack tapered off as the true culprits were now known. Although, apparently, Brous had spent his time on the lam mailing AT&T letters taking credit for the attack, none of which ever seemed to have been read. I assume this is because AT&T's customer service is so bad that they just have a bin in the mailroom filled with terrorist manifestos. But despite this being revealed to be the work of two random guys with no real lasting damage, and with the entirety of the American Republican Army now safely behind bars, the paranoid fever continued to spread, except this time it was the US government's turn to catch the bug. See, Brous and Jensen didn't just knock out TV and phone signals. Unbeknownst to the two would-be revolutionaries, the other, much bigger Republican American Army was also transmitting signals through AT&T's stations, and they were going to make sure that this kind of thing didn't happen again. On June 7th, less than 2 weeks after the attack, the Senate submitted a bill with the catchy name, An Act to Amend Section 1362 of Title 18 of the United States Code so as to further protect the internal security of the United States by providing penalties for malicious damage to certain communication facilities, which would add a section to USC 1352, or Communications Line Standards or Systems. Essentially, while 1352 already criminalized the destruction or sabotage of communication infrastructure owned by the government, this bill would apply the same protections to privately owned infrastructure that was being used by the military. While that seems like a fairly boring and straightforward issue, deciding which circuits could be counted as being for military use versus civilian turned out to be a lot more complicated than you'd think. For one thing, there's a bunch of infrastructure that's being used by the military in secret, so-called black wires. Obviously, they couldn't be expected to reveal which phone lines they're using to spy on people. I mean, what's next? Not being able to spy on people? But there was also an even bigger issue that had to do with the way that these circuits work. Since the network is capable of automatically rerouting signals to avoid downed circuits, what is or isn't being used by the military could change at any given moment. Because of this, in a sense, the network wasn't a static thing, but rather a process or way of thinking. The case for the military was made by representatives of the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization. In particular, a general named Wendell Duplantis testified that since any given circuit could potentially wind up being used by the military, the entire network fell under their jurisdiction, saying, "This is of course very nebulous, but we can say we have a requirement for all of it." Appropriately, the Latin origin of the word nebulous is nebule, or cloud, something that's both vague yet universal. More recently, in 1994, Congress amended the law to criminalize attempted attacks on communication infrastructure, and then, in 2001, the Patriot Act added conspiracy too. There may soon be a new change to this, since last year Laurel Lee introduced the Stopping the Theft and Destruction of Broadband Act of 2025, which would remove the military requirement altogether. Interestingly, IT infrastructure, like say data centers for example, currently sit in a gray area. While there's been efforts to change this, at time of recording, no law exists to specifically protect them. Now, none of this should come as much of a surprise. Governments using these kinds of powerful communication networks in sketchy and unaccountable ways is pretty typical. In fact, this all points to an interesting contradiction regarding the cloud. The more connected a society is, the more vulnerable it tends to be to interference by the government. This was demonstrated by two incidents, both in 2011. For the first, in response to the massive protests brought out by the Arab Spring, the Egyptian government shut off internet access. The response by Western media and politicians was to point to the low-tech nature of Egypt's internet infrastructure, claiming that something similar could never happen in a more connected country.
A few minutes after midnight on January 28th, the internet went dark across Egypt. During the previous 4 days, hundreds of thousands of Egyptians had marched to demand a new government. Millions worldwide answered in real time, "You are not alone, and we are with you." Then the government pulled the plug. Cell phone service was cut off, TV satellite signals were jammed, and internet access was blocked for nearly the entire country.
So this is America.
The government
This
did
is
not
America.
want the
Who are
people
you?
to communicate with each other,
Standing there quiet.
and it did not want the press to communicate with the public. It certainly did not want the world to watch. Together, the freedoms of expression, assembly, and association online comprise what I've called the freedom to connect. The United States supports this freedom for people everywhere, and we have called on other nations to do the same. Because we want people to have the chance to exercise this freedom.
This claim would soon be put to the test in what is quite possibly the most connected place on Earth. On July 3rd of that year in San Francisco, a BART police officer shot and killed a homeless man named Charles Hill who'd allegedly been wielding a knife. The shooting sparked citywide protests, which, like their Egyptian counterparts, were largely organized online. Fearing a repeat of 2009, in which the police murder of an unarmed black man sparked massive protests and riots throughout the city, the cops decided to nip things in the bud by copying the Egyptians. On August 11th, a massive flash protest was scheduled to take place with plans to shut down a number of key San Francisco stations. That morning, BART spokesman Wynton Johnson sent out an email that read, "A whole heck of a lot of their ability to carry out this exercise is predicated on being able to communicate with each other. Can't we just shut off wireless mobile phones and Wi-Fi communication in the downtown stations? It's not like it's a constitutional right for BART to provide mobile phone and Wi-Fi service." And so they did just that. Verizon, Sprint, and AT&T were forced to comply, and the protest never happened. What all this points to is the fact that what the cloud as a concept fundamentally does is conceal. Specifically, the cloud conceals the true nature of the internet as an extractive resource made up of physical infrastructure and human labor. I think that the clearest example of this is the undersea cables I mentioned earlier. Even going back to the old telegraph network, in addition to their colonial purpose, undersea wires have also always had significant military applications, particularly when it came to espionage, as in the case of the British merchant named John Pender, who in 1871 covertly laid underwater telegraph lines along the west coast of Hong Kong Island, connecting China to Europe's telegraph network against the wishes of the Qing government. Similarly, in 1955, then newly appointed director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, also took an interest in undersea cables, seeing their potential as tools of control and surveillance. In declassified CIA memos, we can see plans discussing the construction of a cable connecting San Francisco to Hawaii, but interestingly, no such cable appears on any known map. This same principle holds true with modern fiber optic cables today. As Starosielski notes, the fact that the average person doesn't know anything about them isn't a coincidence, but an intentional policy by the industry to provide the cables with an extra layer of protection, acting as a sort of insulation from prying eyes, just like the polyethylene and copper tubes protect them from sharks. But above all, the main thing that the cloud hides is the labor that goes into running the internet. A lot of this falls under the category of so-called micro work or human intelligence tasks, i.e. unskilled computer work that just barely rises above the level of complexity that can be automated, such as platform moderation, certain product descriptions, image and video analysis, and increasingly, training AI. It's not a coincidence that one of the largest platforms for hiring people to perform this work is Amazon's Mechanical Turk, named after the chess-playing automaton created in 1770 by Wolfgang von Kempelen. Originally conceived in 1769 when the French magician Francois Pellier appeared before the court of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa at Schönbrunn Palace, The Frenchman demonstrated the ability to control the movement of fish in a glass basin and then presented a giant compass with a lettered dial, the arrow of which could spell out answers to questions asked by the audience. The secret behind these and most of Pellier's other miracles were powerful magnets he'd hidden around the stage, on his person, and in the bellies of the fish. One man in attendance that night who was not impressed, however, was von Kempelen, who vowed to one-up Pellier with an even greater illusion, and 1 year later, he did just that. The Mechanical Turk toured the world, winning most games, including ones against Napoleon Bonaparte and Benjamin Franklin, and was capable of performing the Knight's Tour, a chess puzzle in which a single knight visits each square on the board exactly once. The secret to this mechanical marvel was, of course, a chess grandmaster secretly stuffed into the trunk to create the illusion of an autonomous machine. Similarly, Amazon's Mechanical Turk manages the digital labor of an army of underpaid freelancers, performing the kind of work necessary to puppeteer the modern-day cloud, just like von Kempelen's Turk. While you might expect this work to be monotonous, and to be clear, plenty of it is, this gets much darker than people solving CAPTCHAs for a living. A big chunk of the kind of work that gets hidden in the internet's proverbial trunk tends to involve exposing the wretched of the screen to images deemed too graphic for Western eyes. For example, as Bill Perigo reported for The Times, in 2021, when OpenAI was gearing up to release ChatGPT-3, they needed to break its habit of blurting out racial slurs and rape threats that had picked up by being trained on the open internet. To do this, they fed it a massive data set of text and images containing examples of hate speech, gore, and CSAM that had been labeled as inappropriate by gig workers in Kenya, being paid less than $2 an hour to view it. Similarly, in Germany, Syrian content moderators reported being made to review images of their hometowns and even former homes after they'd been devastated by an earthquake, again deemed too disturbing for users in the global north, but not the people who'd been forced to flee from there. In fact, for the companies running these operations, refugees are actually preferred. A common job among the Kurdish refugees now living in northern Iraq to escape the Syrian war has become tagging images of streets and traffic lights in order to train self-driving cars. Recruiters for these companies particularly target women, since the work-from-home nature allows them to earn a living without violating conservative social norms. As one such worker said in an interview in 2023, "Now, most of the people, IDPs and refugees here, especially women, they cannot find jobs easily here. And even if they find jobs in Erbil, they need to pay for transportation from home and back and pay a lot of expenses. And we have one more thing. A lot of girls, they cannot go out to work because of tradition, their father, mother. But while we have micro, while we have online projects, it's really easy for them to work from home. They don't need to go out. They don't need to pay more expenses." Just as John Ruskin realized, the cloud not only emanates out of sites of conflict, it depends on them, as violence and political upheaval become opportunities for cheap labor. This happy relationship in which regional instability grows the pool of workers, quietly keeping the cloud buoyant, is shockingly explicit. In 2013, the World Bank released a statement that cheerfully noted that escalating conflict between Israel and Palestine had the potential to provide a boom for the supply of underpaid tech workers. The Palestinian territories have a tech-savvy young population proficient in English and with a 35% Facebook penetration. The high number of underemployed and unemployed skilled women in cities outside Ramallah offers a valuable source of labor, and Palestinian internet access is competitive compared to other countries in the region. But now, let's get back to what this video is supposed to be about. The most blatant physical manifestation of the cloud: data centers. These obviously play a key role in internet and AI infrastructure, but also as the location of the sleight of hand needed to keep the illusion of the cloud afloat. You see, for data to seem decentralized, it actually needs to be concentrated in one place. And for it to seem weightless, it needs to consume a tremendous amount of power. The data center is the place where those switches happen, and so naturally, like any good magicians, the owners of them really don't want you looking into what's going on there. As I've mentioned, while the massive explosion in their numbers over the last few years has put them on everyone's radar, the internet's been quietly running off of warehouse-sized data centers since the early aughts, and they've done their best to keep a low profile since the very beginning. Seeing as the term warehouse-scale computing was first coined by Google, their first data center in the Dalles makes a pretty good case study. In 2004, Google approached the city to discuss the project, but strangely, rather than bonding over both having strange names, Google instead conducted all negotiations through a shell company simply called Design LLC. What's more, in addition to demanding the city give them access to massive amounts of power and water and letting them skip paying their property taxes for 15 years, Design LLC also required all local officials to sign NDAs that were so intense that these politicians were scared to say that the data center was owned by Google even after local newspapers had confirmed it. Over the years, anonymous LLCs, NDAs, and environmentally conscious promises that are quietly walked back once ground is broken have become the standard playbook for the industry. The only real change is that these companies have gotten much bolder over the years. As Hao reported, in 2023, the government of Uruguay withheld the projected power consumption of a new data center made by Google. And importantly, this isn't something new caused by AI. Back in 2019, Google filed an application to build a data center in Cerrillos, which Chile's environmental agency rubber-stamped, despite the application stating that the facility would use 169 liters of water per second, drawing from an already depleted aquifer during a historic drought. Like, you couldn't come up with a worse example of AI water usage if you tried. Now, as you can probably tell, this massive ramp up in data centers has made it pretty hard for them to lay low now. Pro tip, emitting a constant low frequency hum is a surefire way to blow your cover. With that said, while secrecy isn't working anymore, that hasn't stopped them from trying. Recently in Virginia, residents protesting several data centers uncovered an email from the developer's lawyer suggesting that they be placed under surveillance and that we need a mole or two in this group. As you saw in the intro, this is something I actually had a bit of personal experience with a few nights ago when I decided to pay a visit to one of my local data centers here in Toronto to see the sights and film a bit of B-roll. Turns out they weren't too happy to see me.
So you can't do this without permission. Please leave it.
Okay. The data center in question had the aggressively nondescript name Server Farm Toronto Data Center Tor 1 and was located in a semi-industrial part of Etobicoke where it blended in pretty well with the warehouses and office parks in the area. But as you get closer, some weird details start to stand out, like the fence and security cameras, and wait a second, those aren't real windows. They just painted gray squares on the side of the building. So, given the Wile E. Coyote-ass camouflage, as well as everything I've read about how intense security at these places can be, when I set up my camera, I wasn't expecting to be able to film there for very long. But for a while at least, nothing happened. I was there for around 15 minutes, got about as much footage as I could, and then started packing up to go home and maybe rewrite some of this section. And then, about 30 seconds later, security showed up. So, this is a massive rookie mistake, but since I had literally just turned off my camera and mic, I wasn't able to capture much. Basically, though, here's what happened. First, this guy came out. He asked me what I was doing, but didn't seem to care and just wanted me to leave. I could see from his uniform that he worked for a big third-party security company and really seemed like he was just doing his job. I told him I was already leaving and it was all good. Okay, yeah, all right. But then, as I was packing up, a second guy who seemed to work directly for the data center came out, and he had a very different attitude. He told me that he'd called the cops and that I needed to get out of there, and also really didn't want me to film him.
and I see
Yeah. All of which was fine by me and more or less what I was expecting. But then, as I was packing up, he said that he needed to see all of my footage before I could leave, which is absolutely not true. I was under no obligation to show him anything or answer any questions. So, naturally, I generously agreed to show it to him because I'm dumb and conflict averse. But yeah, after showing him like 5 seconds of B-roll, I got back to packing my shit up while he kind of just kept lecturing me about how this wasn't okay. At this point, I finally got an opportunity to turn my mic back on just in time for him to say this.
The name says a lot about the company. So obviously there's a reason why there's this level of security. So if you're going to record a company that is going as far to keep their business private and secured.
Right. So that's kind of weird, eh? For one thing, I personally think that a company going to great lengths to keep their business private is actually a very good reason for the public to take an interest. But also, what exactly is the name server farm supposed to say about the company? I mean, the Prime Minister of the country is doing press conferences to excitedly announce that we'll be building way more of these.
We'll build sustainably, linking new data center development with expanding clean energy and robust environmental standards. We'll build inclusively, in full partnership with Indigenous peoples.
As I told the security guard, it seems a bit odd to me that the natural assumption would be that the public can't know or even film the exterior of this government-subsidized industry, especially given how it's talked about. Server farm doesn't sound like it's something that I would be like, oh my god, that's so secretive. Do you know what I mean?
Fair enough.
But since these companies are hell-bent on making it as hard as possible to get information on what's going on inside data centers, let's try a different approach. So far, we've been trying to find faces in the cloud, but what about the other perspective? How does the cloud see itself? We can actually learn a lot by examining a pretty strange genre of photography, data center promotional pictures. You've seen these before, right? Long halls of server racks lit up with some kind of cool neon lighting, maybe some close-ups of wires as a treat for the real connoisseurs. Bit of a side note here, by the way, but is it just me, or has everyone's algorithm gone completely insane with the ads they're seeing now? Like, maybe it's just because of all the stuff I've been reading about for this video, but YouTube is absolutely convinced that I own a mid-level manufacturing business in desperate need of AI solutions.
Geotab data has allowed us to strengthen our truck license system, drive efficiencies by driving down the number of trucks through improved turns.
We have some of the best turn times in North America. The amount of data that these telematics devices produce and can give you is phenomenal.
The data is what brings people together.
But however these pictures have come into your life, a running theme you may have noticed is that there's never any people in them. And that is weird. As I've mentioned, it's pretty well documented that data centers tend to have shockingly few full-time employees once they're up and running, and there is plenty of talk in the industry of eventually getting to so-called lights-out facilities that are essentially fully automated, but that's not happening anytime soon, and they absolutely need technicians to keep these things running. So where are they? Apparently, the answer is just out of frame. In a paper called The Data Center as Technological Wilderness, A.R.E. Taylor interviewed a data center photographer who explained, most data center briefs specify that they don't want their workers in the photographs. If you've got a nice photo of a sci-fi looking space, you don't want some bloke there fixing a server in his jeans. The reason for this is, as George Bursey, the owner of a UK cloud service provider called Secura, explained to Taylor, simple really. The top cause of data center downtime is human error, so the less human these buildings can be made to look, the more safe and secure they appear. Interestingly though, there's actually a long history of these kinds of images, pristine landscapes completely uncorrupted by the presence of humans. As Taylor points out, while beautiful, these representations of America have long been criticized for the way they smuggle in the colonial idea of the land being empty prior to the arrival of European settlers, and also that humans aren't a part of nature at all. In Empire of AI, Karen Hao argues that the best metaphor to understand the AI industry through is, unsurprisingly, empire, in that, just like the empires of old, the AI industry operates by exploiting the subjugated labor of some of the poorest in the world in the name of resource extraction, all of which and more is justified through competition with other companies and foreign powers. And so, it's pretty fitting that the industry has also produced its own genre of images depicting idyllic landscapes untouched by humans, but rather than a natural environment, they instead show what Taylor calls a technological wilderness, uninhabited jungles with server farm trees and wire vines under an RGB sky. This gets even weirder though. Coming back to this map, as I was going through the entries on datacenter.com, I noticed something strange. It turns out that very few data centers are making pictures of techno-dystopian landscapes the old-fashioned way anymore. Instead, the data center industry has embraced AI. Unbelievable. I am boycotting blockchain digital infrastructure until they start hiring human photographers again. Who's with me? Well, this, of course, isn't a surprising development. These are very, very weird in a way that only pictures that were likely never meant to be seen by a human being can be. Unfortunately, I scrolled through all 10,519 of these, and now you're gonna hear about them. By far, the most common style of picture you see are these exterior shots of futuristic buildings like this one from AT Tokyo, which is apparently made entirely out of air conditioners. A lot of these use the same picture over and over again, particularly Amazon Cloud Services, who often just go with this same stock picture. But they do mix things up a bit too, with custom pictures based on wherever the data center is located. For example, here's one in Sydney, Australia, where they made sure to include famous landmarks like the Bridge and Opera House. This one is in Plain City, Ohio, and is appropriately generic. Or there's this one in Telangana, India, which is, warm looking, I guess? Also, as you probably noticed, these were made by an older model, so not only are these buildings insane and impossible, but we also get a lot of the LSD font. This is especially bad with Apple, which looks pretty rough. Also, interestingly, a lot of the older man-made promotional pictures try to make data centers look environmentally friendly by showing them in a big green field or something. These AI ones go a very different direction and instead seem to lean into how much electricity they use, depicting themselves as being surrounded by power lines, industrial cooling units, oil rigs, and glowing blue with electrical energy, often so much so that electricity and/or the internet is seen exploding out of the roof. Oh, also, the funniest one in my opinion is from the state-owned Qatari telecom company Ooredoo. This one actually isn't AI though. Instead, it's just an extremely low-res picture of a car showroom. And look, obviously it's not a surprise that the people making data centers are happy to use AI slop, but to me, there's something unsettling about these pictures. It's tempting to anthropomorphize AI here and think of these pictures as a sort of self-portrait, glimpses into how the cloud wants to be seen. I prompted Gemini to make a picture of itself, and unsurprisingly, the result wouldn't be out of place in these promotional pictures. But I think the better way to look at this is as a continuation of the older promotional pictures, where the goal was to keep any evidence of human workers hidden out of the frame. That erasure has expanded now to the point where they don't even need a photographer at all. Now, something that's made this video a bit tricky to research is the fact that while data centers are absolutely nothing new, they've changed a lot over the last 4 years. Not only have they exploded in size and numbers since 2022, but their purpose has changed from pretty much only being used for storage to now handling compute. As a result, data centers have generally been an extremely niche subject for research, and what little has been written about them is, for the most part, more than 4 years old from when they served a very different purpose. That said, as we're wrapping things up now, I want to focus on that shift that took place. To do that, we first need to dive into what data centers used to be. Prior to AI, while pretty much all data centers were alike in their focus on storage, they absolutely weren't all made equal. Back then, the thing that distinguished the high-end, though, wasn't size, but security. The biggest and most expensive data centers were generally used to back up and protect information belonging to governments, militaries, financial institutions, medical records, and corporate secrets. If you've seen Mr. Robot, the heist they do in the first season is on one such data center called Steel Mountain. This is actually based on a real company called Iron Mountain, which was once the largest data center company on Earth. Originally called Iron Mountain Atomic Storage Inc., they lived up to that name by building their massive data centers inside mine shafts and decommissioned nuclear bunkers. However, all of this is more or less just for advertising through some high production security theater, since the leading cause of data center outages or leaks isn't an invading army, but human error, as we just heard from the owner of Secura, and was the case in that episode of Mr. Robot.
24/7 armed guards, closed circuit cameras.
All we need is one security flaw.
Look at this place, man. It was built not to have any.
I see about 6 walking around.
Good show. As Who argues, though, since these data centers are more vulnerable to a phishing attack than a nuclear one, and all this Cold War bunker-style security is pretty much just symbolic, it's worth considering what a bunker symbolizes. To do this, we can turn to the work of the French theorist Paul Virilio. Born in Paris in 1932, a great deal of Virilio's most formative years were shaped by the Nazi occupation. In the summer of 1945, he saw the sea for the first time and became fascinated by it, as well as the many remnants of the war that littered La Plage de la Boule. In particular, Virilio became obsessed with bunkers and began exploring and documenting them, ultimately resulting in the book Bunker Archaeology, where he describes them with a sort of abstraction that fluctuates between poetic and the kind of thing you might expect to see from like an alien archaeologist studying Earth in the distant future. For example, he writes that the point of warfare is to create a sort of artificial environment that's inhospitable to humans, one where fires blaze, the air and water are poisoned by gas and nuclear radiation, and the rain is made of hot lead. In this environment, the bunker stands out as a sort of oasis. This makes them inherently anachronistic, both in times of war where they act as an oasis, and times of peace where they stick out like a shipwrecked submarine. Yeah, it's that kind of book. But in the notes he took exploring various bunkers across Europe, Virilio was reminded of another kind of structure: the Egyptian mastabas, the Etruscan tombs, the Aztec structures. For Virilio, the bunker serves as a sort of modern-day tomb, but crucially, one that its inhabitants return from. The function of this very special structure is to assure survival, to be a shelter for man in a critical period, the place where he buries himself to subsist. It thus belongs to the crypt that prefigures the resurrection. What makes this so interesting to me is that, as I said, while researching this video, a big issue has been trying to reconcile what data centers have historically been and what they've now become. What changed? That quote made it all click. If data centers have always been bunkers, crypts that prefigure the resurrection, then the thing that they've kept buried has been our data, which, thanks to AI, is now being reanimated, rising from the tomb to come back and haunt us. Thanks for watching.